Alrighty, welcome to our lesson on energy from biomass. And if you have missed cat noises, there is the potential for them because I'm recording from home again and they're all hanging around watching me. So, before we can talk about how we produce energy from biomass, let's remember what biomass is. So, there's a slightly different definition for biomass here than there is in our ecology unit, where we talked about how biomass is the dry mass of an organism. Here, we're saying it's some biological material derived or coming from living organisms that we use to produce energy. An example of that is incinerating or burning things. An example is burning wood because wood is a biological material that comes from some living organism, trees, and it is being used to produce energy. Burning biomass has an advantage. It produces heat energy at a relatively low cost. So, if you're in a less developed country or if you're in an area with high poverty, biomass can be used to heat homes and heat areas without having to spend a large amount of money. There is the possibility of burning biomass to generate electricity. Here you see a diagram of a biomass incineration plant where you take, and usually this is done with waste material. So a city could decrease the amount of waste it has to put in a landfill by sending some of it to a biomass incineration facility where it is sorted. Whatever is burnable is put into an area for combustion that is burned, and when it's burned, it's going to produce heat, which is used to heat up water and produce steam. That steam is then used to turn a turbine, and that turbine turns a generator, which produces electricity. Similar consequences as you have with producing electricity by burning anything. For example, like coal, you do produce ash, like here. And you do sometimes have to have, for example, spray of the waste products or the waste exhaust to kind of remove some of the particulate matter, and then that has to be disposed of. Um, this is not a really super high yield, so it's not like we could switch to just burning all of our trash for waste, especially because a lot of our trash, if you burned it, might produce toxic compounds. So you have to sort all of that stuff out. A large amount of biomass is used as a fuel additive or replacement. So, biofuels are any liquid fuels produced from organic matter. Now, in and of itself, the combustion of these or burning them doesn't introduce additional carbon into the atmosphere. And some examples are renewable diesel, biodiesel, and biogas. So let's look at this statement a little more. How the combustion doesn't introduce additional carbon into the atmosphere. If we look at fossil fuels, these fossil fuels were removed from the carbon cycle in a reservoir for hundreds of millions of years. When we extract it, we are adding more carbon into the air than was originally there. And so that increases CO2 levels. However, when we burn biomass, plants take in CO2 and they turn that into biomass, which, when we burn it, produces CO2, which can then be taken up by living plants. So we're not actually adding carbon to the carbon cycle because we're not taking it from a reservoir where it was stored away from kind of interacting with the rest of the cycle. So that's why using biofuels is considered to be carbon neutral. We'll talk in a little bit about some of the environmental impacts of that, though. So, bioethanol is a very popular form of biofuel. It's often used as an additive, not really used as a substitute for gasoline. It's used to dilute gasoline. Um, because if you try and use pure ethanol, there's some problems that come with it. Unfortunately, it really doesn't give us a lot of energy for the amount of energy that's put in. So it's not necessarily very energy efficient on its own. This is something that's widely used in the US, Brazil, and Europe. And in the United States, in large part, it's supported by government corn subsidies. This is money from the government to support. And so, if the government wasn't putting that money into this program in paying corn farmers to produce corn for bioethanol, it probably wouldn't be as lucrative or as money producing for them. So, they might be less inclined to grow corn for ethanol. What you usually do is you ferment plant matter in a similar method to like yeast fermenting bread or bacteria fermenting out material to produce alcohol. And there are a lot of different plants that can be fermented to produce bioethanol. Now, the really big one is corn. Because we produce a lot of it and it has a lot of nice starch that's very easy to break down. But you can use different plants. Sugarcane, for example, is widely used in Brazil. Sorghum, which is another grain, switchgrass, which is actually kind of a weed. So the advantage of that is that we don't really have to put a lot of fertilizer or water into growing it, and it doesn't take away from food resources. On the other hand, we can also use barley, potatoes, sunflower, molasses, and wheat. And then there's hemp as well, which is often used to produce rope and things like that. So all of those can be used for bioethanol. Some of them are more difficult to use than others, just because they might have a little more cellulose in them, which is a plant starch that's kind of hard to break down. Then there's biogas. So if you have a lot of manure on hand, for example, or you have crop waste, if you're a farmer, you can actually, instead of trying to throw that away, instead of letting it pollute the environment, you could actually put it in what's called an anaerobic digester and use that to produce biogas. Biogas is very similar to natural gas in that it's mostly methane, so it's a lot of CH4, which means you can use it to produce, you can burn it to produce like electricity or heat. It's more carbon neutral than extracting natural gas from the ground because, this is part of the natural carbon cycle. This has to be done in a digester though, because these guys right here, which are bacteria, are going to only produce the methane in the absence of oxygen. So that's what anaerobic means, without O2. And so you let this waste sit there with some specific species of bacteria with no oxygen, and they'll produce methane. So, what are some of the environmental effects of using biomass? Well, if you use biomass and you burn it for heat production, it produces a lot of air pollutants. Some of the air pollutants it produces are carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, some nitrogen oxides, some VOCs, and I think that's about it. So it does produce a lot of pollutants, especially if you're just burning this, say, in a fireplace or in a cooking stove. And I forgot particulate matter. That's the one I was missing. And then if you are burning trees for warmth, if you overharvest trees, that can cause deforestation. So here we come to our summary slide. What are the pros? Well, when you use it sustainably, it's going to be a renewable resource. It does produce less sulfur dioxide than fossil fuels, so it's going to contribute less to things like acid rain. You can, if you're using plants that aren't like crop plants that require a lot of fertilizer or water, you can grow plants in less desirable locations, say on hillsides or along the sides of highways, and that can help reduce soil erosion, and then this can create more jobs in rural areas. Some of the cons, well, if you're growing crops for this, that means that you're going to be using water and fertilizer. If that's inorganic fertilizers, that's bad for the environment. Herbicides or pesticides, that's also bad for the environment. If you're clearing forests, like in Brazil, I know a lot of areas in the Amazon were being cleared to grow sugarcane, and that caused deforestation. If you don't burn this efficiently, that can create air pollution. And there's also a problem that for example, in the United States, where we're growing a lot of corn and using it for ethanol, that's land that used to be used for agriculture to feed people and our livestock that's instead now being used for biofuels, which means we're going to have to clear more land for agricultural use. And then cars have to be designed to use biofuels. You'll see if you have a car that can use some of these biofuels, it'll say it's a flex fuel, meaning it might use what's called E85 gas, meaning it is 85% ethanol. And it is still, though, 15% gasoline. So some of these biofuels, you can't really, because of their chemical properties, you can't use them to power cars by themselves. You need to mix them with gasoline. So they're a bit more of an extender for gasoline than they are a replacement for it. All right, that is it. And next lesson coming up soon.